Okay, so welcome everyone here. It's my great pleasure to have you all around. And the main question is, why are you here? Are you here because your supervisor told you to come here? Are you here because you think yourself have space for improvement in terms of your presentation skills? Or is there any other reason why you showed up? So probably most of you think, maybe I can learn something a little bit here on how to improve. Giving talks, and my goal is, doesn't matter where you start, if you have never given a talk before, or if you have given already 100 talks, there should be something in there for you that you can use in order to improve your presentation skills. So why at all we're talking about presentations here? The reason for this is that the success that you probably have in your academic career depends to a substantial degree on how well you can communicate. And in academia, we mainly have two ways for communication, or two main ways. The first one is actually writing papers. And the second one is giving oral presentations about the work that we have done. There could be different things like paper presentations, a PhD defense, a proposal defense, a job interview talk, and other things within the academic content or context where we need to present our ideas to other people. And one of the key things is, in order to be successful, they are competing ideas. We need to be good in communicating our ideas to others. Right? And so the communication is not only talking about my ideas, but also making sure that the idea reaches the brain of the other person, of the audience. So it's not just kind of getting the words out, but also increasing the likelihood that the words actually stick into the brain of the audience. And a lot of the things we are doing, or what I'm presenting here, are tricks that you can do in order to increase the probability that what you are saying will actually stick with the audience. And it's basically the idea of implanting the ideas that you have in your head into the head of the audience. So you have an idea, and you are talking to other people. And one way of talk or of communication is actually giving a presentation like the one I'm doing right now here. So you communicate the ideas to other people. We're doing this orally through a presentation. And what your goal is, that this idea also sticks in the brains and the heads of the other people. If you achieve that, then this is kind of the first form of success that you have in order to spread your idea. There may be other things that you may want to achieve. You may want to generate a certain action that people are doing based on what you have communicated. But that's kind of the step which comes afterwards. The first step is to actually get the ideas from your head into the head of the other person. And even if you are a person who, let's say, have given, 20 talks, so you have already some experience, I actually make a promise that by the tools and tricks that I'm going to present here, you should get better, at least twice as better talks in terms of how many people do you reach in terms of implementing the ideas or implanting the ideas into their heads. And even if you have just given whatever 5 talks, you're in the beginning of your PhD or even a master's student, you should get roughly 10 times better. And there's no kind of black magic in there. These are actually things which are, if you see them individually, are kind of obvious, but if you put all of them together, they actually work really well. And so we start with saying, what is actually a great talk? What's the purpose of not the purpose of a great talk, but what makes a talk a good talk? And from my point of view, there are 3 things that you need to do. First, you want to stimulate interest in the topic you're talking about. If you're talking about your research, you want to stimulate interest in other people about your research, what you're doing, what you have been working on for the last year, for example. And what you also want to do, you want to make sure the key messages that you try to communicate are actually transported well, and this is what I meant before, reach the brains of the audience, of the other people. And last but not least, you want to generate typically some kind of action out of it. There are some forms of presentation where you may not want to create an action, but often there's at least some action following your presentation to some degree. So what needs to be done to make a talk a good talk? So in order to transport or communicate those messages so that they actually reach the other person, you need to make sure that the persons are not falling asleep or are not bored. So if they fall asleep, it's clear, nothing will reach that person. But even if they're very bored, so if they're looking something like this, then you probably lost the audience. And a lot of the things we're doing is trying to avoid boredom at the audience. And this has also to do with, are you interested about your topic yourself? And can you communicate this interest or your passion to the audience? But also a couple of other things are important for that. I just want to start with basically 3 things which I think are most important in order to keep the audience engaged. And then we look into other things on how you can modify your environment, because on how you structure your talk, what is special in certain academic talks. But the first three general things hold basically for all presentations, at least from my point of view. So the first and most important thing from my point of view is the why question. You need to tell the audience why something that you're talking about is actually relevant. And I will try to make a few examples later on, even giving different ways of starting a talk in order to illustrate that depending on how you approach the why question, you will get different results. People are more interested or less interested in this. So the why matters. Why should I care? What will this talk enable for me? These are key questions to answer. There's this nice billboard saying love is why, or you can turn it around, why is love? Basically meaning if you don't provide a why, it basically means you don't care about your audience. If you just start without telling why I should care as a person sitting in the audience, that's really bad style. That's, from my point of view, the worst mistake you can do. The second thing you can do, or the second trick you can do in order to keep the audience engaged, is something which is called an empowerment promise. So a promise that you gain knowledge, something that you can do or know after the presentation that you didn't know beforehand. And this is actually something which is pretty good for lectures. If you lecture, which is a fairly long presentation compared to regular talks, that you want to communicate within the first, let's say, 3 minutes to make sure what will you be able to do that you can't do before. That's actually pretty helpful. And the third and last thing is you need to present in a passionate manner. You need to be passionate about the topic you are presenting. That's not always possible. Maybe you're extremely bored about what you need to present because someone asked you to give a talk, and it's hard to fake that. But the more passionate you're about the research you're talking about, the topic you're talking about, the easier it is. And this also means, for example, even if you have your presentation done, remove everything which is kind of boring. It's not at the core. It's not needed in order to understand your ideas, or which is important to get your message across. And you also need to present in a way that you're confident about what you're talking. This also helps to keep the audience engaged. Before we dive into the details, or a few more details, you also should clarify yourself, what is your intent? Why are you actually giving this talk? What's the goal of you giving this talk? And depending what kind of talk it is, it could be very different. So I just listed a few potential intents that you may have. You may want to instruct or inform an audience. And this is something that we typically do in a lecture. We want to instruct people, enable people to do something, to learn something, so that whatever they later on come to our labs, they have certain capabilities, they can solve certain problems and gain new abilities or communicate relevant information. This is what we typically do in a lecture. If you are at a conference and you want to present your work, it's typically not that much an instruction, it's more an information. And you may also want to convince the audience that the thing that you have done is actually cool and worth discussing, worth citing, worth using in order to spread your idea. If you are discussing with colleagues, or you're in a business setting where you need to make a decision in which direction to proceed with the project, you may even want to persuade the other people on buying into your idea and shipping your idea forward. You typically want to generate an action, so it could be a vote for something. You want to make a statement and make a proposal for something, and people need to vote which way they want to go. This could also be an outcome of your presentation. Or you want to sell something. So if you're giving a presentation about a proposal, for example, we want to sell an idea because in the end we want to get money for that idea, for this research proposal. And if you want to defend that, that's typically a quite different talk to a paper presentation that you're doing. Or maybe you just want to entertain the audience because you're giving a dinner speech, and then again, the way you present is totally different. So the important thing is to know your own intent. This helps you to structure your talk and identify what's important for you and what's less important for you. And in my presentation here today, I want to look into 5 different talks that are relevant in academia. That's a lecture, so standing in the lecture hall every week, teaching to students, for example. This could be a paper presentation. It's the second type of talk. You worked for a year or half a year on a research topic, and you have something between 5 minutes to 20 minutes to present your work to a large audience. Something which is very challenging and very frightening for the starting PhD students. First time being in a conference, talking in a room which houses 200 or 300 people. All are experts in the field, and you need to communicate what you have done. Can be actually pretty scary. Or you worked already for 4 or 5 years on your PhD, and then you need to defend your PhD thesis, or maybe your master thesis. And also, those talks are more similar to conference talk than to others, but also have some certain things that the audience wants to figure out to, let's say, make a judgment if you should deserve your degree, yes or no. Or you need to defend a proposal. You're asking for money, you need to defend that. Or you're giving a job interview, and especially an academic job interview, maybe applying for a professor position. What is important in those types of talks? And I want to go at least briefly into those different presentations in the end and talk a little bit about what's special about those presentations. But the majority of things I will be talking actually holds for all kinds of talks, things that you can do in order to keep the audience engaged, or as engaged as possible. And there are a lot of levers you can pull, a lot of small things you can do. And maybe some things are easier for you and some are harder. So you don't need to adapt everything which I'm presenting here. Even if you make small steps and saying, okay, I'm only optimizing whatever, the start of my presentation, or how to end, or how to tackle a Q&A, this will overall improve the quality of your presentation. And I want to start with something which people typically ignore, and that is the environment. So the environment in which you give your presentation will have an impact how well people buy your idea, so to say. Typically, the conferences we give our talks in don't look like this. So this would be a very beautiful room, nicely lit, but this is something that we typically don't have. We typically have rooms like this one over here, and this is actually already a pretty nice room, has some very nice features that we have. I'd like to present in here. Other rooms are maybe not that great. So what makes a room a good room and a bad room? So I brought you one example, though this was is Andres Miliotto, one of my former PhD students, giving his, I think, second conference talk at ICRA 2018. The first talk he was giving half a year before here in Bonn at a small conference. And this was a huge room hosting more than 1,500 people. Of course, not everyone was there, but he was standing there very scary and holding onto the board, presenting his ideas, but he gave a really engaging and really good presentations. So what is important about this room? What worked well in this environment here? So one thing which is good is that the person and the screen, from my point of view, have roughly the same size. So it's not that you have a very huge screen and you as a person are a tiny element in there, which makes it hard for the audience to concentrate on you, the main person presenting, and not just look to your slides. There are certain things I would change if I would design that room, but of course, often you can't control the room, but sometimes you can. And if you are at a large conference like this one, everything is managed, you have very little influence into that, but quite often you have an influence on how the room is set up, on how the lighting is done in order to make a change. So the first thing is, if you present in a room like this, which is completely dark, it's quite likely that people will fall asleep, or at least close their eyes for a second. So it's better to keep the room bright, like over here, we have a lot of natural daylight, which is great. This helps you to keep people awake. And if some people say, yeah, but then you don't see the slides really well, you can always argue it's easier to see slides if it's a little bit bright rather than through closed eyes. Because if people sleep, they won't realize anything. And the darker it is, the more likely you're actually falling asleep. So what I recommend is turn the lights on, let natural daylight in, even if you can't see the slides that perfectly. Maybe it's also a reason that your font size is too small and everything is too tiny. You should increase this a little bit. So there's one thing that you can try to do. Simply switch on the lights. It's something you typically have control over. Not necessarily at a conference room, but in most other settings. The next thing is, should I use a microphone, yes or no? So typically you come to a site, you find a microphone like this. Do I need one or do I not need one? It's actually hard to say beforehand. Typically, I would recommend, if you're in doubt, always use the microphone. I have a fairly loud voice, and I think I can actually entertain that room here even without a microphone. But now I use a microphone because putting it on later, if you realize there are too many people in here, it gets a little bit loud, the air conditioning goes on, that's actually bad. So I recommend using a microphone, especially if you're in doubt. Those microphones, however, I really don't like because you have to hold the microphone in front of your hands and you have to keep it more or less still, otherwise it gets silent and loud depending on the distance of the microphone to your mouth. And I'm moving a lot, I'm walking around a lot. This is a disaster, so I have to, force myself to do something like this. So I prefer a Lavalier microphone, which I'm typically using. And these are those microphones that I'm actually wearing here right now, because I can move much more freely. You can also have one which is actually attached to your head, so a headset microphone. That's also good, but everything is better than these guys over here, where you're basically tight to one place where you need to stand and talk always here into the microphone. That's something which I always try to avoid. So I always prefer those microphones. And if you're giving a talk, you can often ask for a different microphone. So even if the microphone is not the microphone you want, you can typically talk to people and say, I want to have a different microphone. So that's me at one of the conference where we were supposed to stay there and present there from this sideboard, which is something I really dislike. And therefore I asked, can I have a different microphone? And maybe it takes a second, but they brought me at least this microphone here, which again, I had to hold my hand to not move too much around. But at least it was better because I could freely move around. I could go to this presentation. I could show something on the slides. And it's much more, I can connect much better to the audience if I can move around, if I'm not hiding behind one of those boards, something I don't like. So in general, I would say you should also try to avoid any barriers between you and the audience. There's something I really like here. If there would be, whatever, a big board over here and tables, there would be a much bigger disconnection between you and me. And if it's kind of, there's no barrier here, I can actually walk towards to you and come closer to you, which I can use as an element to showcase that certain things are more important or less important. And so I always try to walk around. The disadvantage with this is you don't have your computer here, you can't look to your slides. And you don't have the presenter view where you may have some notes or something like this. So if you do this for the first time, you may feel a bit uncomfortable with this. But I recommend to train that because it actually comes fairly easy to do that once you have done this a few times. And what you need if you want to walk around is actually this guy over here, this presenter. This is your friend. This is something you can very easily use, to walk around up to 4, 5, 6, 7 meters, walk around and advance your slides. So it's my one and only tool that I'm using in every presentation. What I however never use in a presentation is actually the laser pointer, this thing over here. I find it very ridiculous to stand there. You're nervous and you get whatever, things like this. It always looks very weird. So I try to go there, point to something if I want to. And often if I need to point something on the slide, it's often an indicator that the slide is actually too packed. Sometimes there may be a reason for this. You have a figure or a diagram and you want to show something very specific in a diagram. Maybe you want to go there and point to something specific or something in a formula. But often, as soon as you need to start pointing to something, I would either make an arrow like this one over here and advance it with a slide, rather than staying there and trying with a laser pointer to point something on the presentation, something I really would like, or really recommend you to avoid. And what is also one thing one can try to do, or what should do, is avoid competing with the screen. So you and the screen should be ideally interact with each other. So if it's set up like here, I can actually walk around, I can point to something, I can show something, and I'm not tied to something. It's not a very huge screen and I'm super tiny and everyone just looking to the slides. I can actually walk around. I don't have any problem to stand in front of the slides. So this is an example from one of my lectures. I'm just simply walking around and point to something on the slide if I want to show something, whatever, some weird thing in this image histogram, for example. It's much easier than being here and just advancing in the arrow points there. So I really try to encourage you to interact with your presentation. And this is, for example, also something that I use when I record videos about presentations. So I do a lot of videos, and my video setup is this one over here. So I have a screen, and the screen is approximately my size. So that I can stand next to the screen and can very easily interact with the screen, not being in a huge lecture hall where there's a large screen and I'm a tiny person, because I get completely lost. So if you have control over that, I recommend having a balance between you and the screen, or at least not let the screen dominate you. Use it to interact with the screen. You can point on something. That's much easier. Of course, in a conference, you won't have control over those settings. But if you're organizing an event, if you're in a lecture hall or somewhere else, you can have quite some control if you go early and can rearrange the room that it fits actually pretty well. One comment is, should you stand left or right of the screen? What do you think? What would be good? Should I stand left or right of the screen? Any ideas? What's better, what's worse?
Maybe depends on which hand you are using.
Exactly. It depends on your pointing hand. So if I'm right-handed as I should typically stand here because I can point something like this. What you don't want to do, if this is my pointing hand, to do something like this and turn your back to the audience. Therefore, depending where you are, you should stay, either you should get used, so I'm right-handed and typically point with my right hand, but typically, for whatever reason, most of the time the computers are standing on that side, on the wrong side for me. So you need to get used to point with your left hand. It's much better than turning around, something which is always odd. And it's just, you can get used to it very easily. It's something which makes it nicer because you can keep the connection with the audience. You can look to the audience and you don't turn your back to the audience, something which is always At least to me, feels always very weird if people do that. And what you sometimes see, never sit down. If you sit down and give a talk sitting, that gets super boring. Your voice is less engaging, it sounds much more boring. So even if I give a presentation on Zoom typically, and at least I'm in the office where I have a standing desk, I put up my standing desk and I stand in front of my desk in order to give the presentation. Only if I'm at home where I don't have a standing desk, then I may sit down. But typically you give better presentations if you're standing. Therefore, I would recommend never to sit down. Always stand up when you give a presentation. You're simply talking in a more interactive and more engaging manner. Okay, these are certain things you can fix in your room. So lights, microphone, barriers between the audience and you. Where should you stand? Where should you point? Can you use a pointer? And maybe you have even control over your time when you're giving the presentation. So when do you think is a good time to give a presentation? Let's say you should give a very important talk and you can choose the time when you want to give a presentation. Which time would you choose?
Morning.
When in the morning?
Morning between 10 and 11.
That's a pretty good starting point. So I would argue you should give your talk in London. So something between whatever, 10 a.m. in the morning and maybe 12 o'clock. People are not hungry, they are all awake. No one is falling asleep. So we're giving the talk now at 2 p.m., which had a different reason because we wanted to serve some drinks afterwards. And we thought serving drinks at whatever, 11:30 in the morning may be a bit suboptimal. So that was the reason why we said, okay, let's do the talk at 2 p.m. and not at 10 a.m. But if it would be an important talk for me, for an interview or something like this, where I would have control over the time, it's better to take the slot in the morning. People are less tired listening to you, and the probability that they will remember what you're saying is actually larger. Okay? So these so far were things you have some control over, but not necessarily always control over. But if you have control over them, use them in your advantage. Now there are a couple of other things we can do. And this is choosing your tools. So what are tools you can use in order to make your presentation better instead of just talking? So there are certain things you can do in order to bring some material with you in order to make things more memorable or focus people on something. And before you select a tool, you should ask yourself, what's the purpose? What do I want to achieve? What support do I need? It's like whatever. If you need to nail a hammer into the wall, you shouldn't use a screwdriver. You should take a hammer because that's the appropriate tool for that. And there are also things for some of the actions you're doing or some of the presentations, certain tools are better than others. You should take that into account. But first of all, let's think, what are tools for, like slides or props that I bring, or using the blackboard in order to write something on the board? What is it good and what is it bad for? So there are certain things that tools should support you with. They shouldn't steal the show, that all the attention of the audience goes to the slides and you're just whatever, hiding somewhere behind the board because no one should see you. That's typically a bad idea. You want to be in focus. You're the person presenting and you want to be seen. Slides, for example, or other tools can help you to support understanding a concept. That's something what the physics people typically do extremely well. If you take a lecture on experimental physics, they're always doing some experiments, some stuff you can touch, you can see, and this is typically very memorable. So this is very good for understanding and memorizing things. It's a very great tool. We typically don't have that often. We don't bring stuff, at least in my field, I don't typically bring stuff with me to the lecture hall, or very, very rarely. The other thing you can do, you can focus your attention, the attention of the audience onto something. So if you have whatever, for example, a complex drawing or a conceptual drawing which shows something, you want to put the focus on some aspect of this whole thing, this whole system. You can also use drawings really well to focus the attention of the audience onto something. And for that, these tools can also be really useful, such as slides, or being inspiring, showing a video which inspires people to do something. What is possible which wasn't possible before? Also for that, it can be a really good tool. And in general, I find 3 different types of tools that we have in presentations, which are typically used. The first one are props, so basically material you bring, stuff you know from your physics classes, or if you have studied physics or taken your minors in physics, you know what I'm talking about. Other people use the blackboard or slides. These are whatever, the typical things that we are using today. And I want to show briefly what you can do with props and how, if you're a very experienced presenter, what kind of great stuff you can do if you bring props in order to explain stuff that it gets very memorable for the audience. And for that, I I don't do it myself. I mean, I studied physics. I didn't really like it, I have to say. But the experimental physics lectures are actually pretty good on to remember things. And there's Walter Levine. He was a professor at MIT, and he had a series called For the Love of Physics. And he's a very good presenter. He used a lot of props and just cut a, 2-minute video out of his lecture and show you how you can use things so that people remember concepts really well. And just want to kind of show this to give you an idea what's possible, because I could never do that well. I mean, the idea of the conservation of energy is nothing which is new, it's something you learned at school. But once you do an experiment like this, it becomes very memorable. People are very likely to remember these things. And you could even see the audience laughing, and all the people actually fairly old, the physics department at MIT, they all know that, but they are still entertained by this and are able to remember those things really well. Unfortunately, I don't have such cool props, but if you have good props, I recommend using them. They can be really useful in order to emphasize your message, to show something. I also don't really feel qualified to talk about why using a blackboard is great. I have a bad handwriting, at least on the blackboard, and I sometimes do a drawing on the blackboard in my lectures or do a simple derivation. Maybe that happens, but typically I try to avoid using the blackboard. The blackboard compared to slides is a big advantage that it's actually a fairly slow thing. So you can't write faster than people can actually read, or seldomly, some people can, but typically not. But I can advance my slides really, really quickly, to get through a large number of slides in a short amount of time. So the blackboard has the advantage that you actually very well adapted to the speed of the audience which is listening. But again, I'm not a person who was ever trained using a blackboard. I don't find it very, very good. I'm not excited if I need to use it, so I won't give you any recommendation on the blackboard. I'm typically using slides because they are portable. I can very easily change them. They are reusable, so it's the default choice, and I guess it's not a surprise to all of you. And most of you will be using slides as their main tool. What I don't want to hear and do in this talk, however, is give you a lecture on slide design, how to build good slides. That's actually something that I'm currently preparing, so there will be a follow-up lecture of this one on good slide design. I just have kind of 3 most important things from my point of view, which I want to give you, things to avoid when you make slides, and there will be a whole lecture on slide design as well. And the first and most important thing from my point of view, if you build slides, is to acknowledge the fact that the humans have only one language processor. So we can either listen to spoken words or we can read them. But we are very bad in doing this at the same time. So there are actually experiments being conducted. If you read at least full sentences, and I'm telling them to you without having the slides being activated, and you do an experiment how many people in the audience remember what I said. Then you do the same thing with just showing the text as slides and not talking to this at all. And the third group, I put them on the slides and I'm reading out what's written there. And it turns out if you do both, people remember less than just reading or just listening. And the reason for this is that you can only process one cue at the same point in time. You can't do this, you can't process language in 2 cues in parallel. And therefore, the golden rule number 1 from my point of view if you do slides is slides are not your teleprompter. You see a lot of presentations where people basically read what's written on the slide. Maybe they leave out a few individual words, but they basically have sentences or reduced sentences on their slides, which is something which is very little engaging, and people simply don't remember what you're doing. So my first rule would be slides are not a teleprompter. Try to avoid that. Acknowledge the fact that people can't process multiple language cues in parallel. You can have a few bullet points, but maybe you can even see if you can get rid of the bullet points, but often we use them. But try to minimize the amount of text you put on your slide. The second thing which you mostly see is wrong is actually a font size is nearly always too small. So there's kind of this rule, or this rule of thumb, that people say the minimum font size you should use is half the age of the oldest person in the room. So assuming that there may be a professor around which is approaching retirement, 60, I would say never go below 30. Of course, it's just a rule of thumb. You make it a little bit smaller, but I try to keep things large. It's so much easier to read, even though the people in the audience, you can easily read this. This font size, whatever, is 72 or something like this. So you can get even larger. What you also should do, kind of less is more. put less material in your slides and talk about it. And the key thing is basically just one idea per slide. So don't have slides which are filled with ideas and you talk for the slide for 15 minutes or something, or whatever, 5 minutes. Break the ideas up onto different ideas, onto different slides, and explain them one after the other. It's much, much easier to grasp. So as a rule of thumb, your slides should be as simple as possible, as clear as possible, and from my point of view, also as beautiful as possible. And of course, there's a limited amount of time that you typically can put into a presentation. You can always do it better. You have to find some compromise, but really try to make it simple, clear, and beautiful. Again, try to do another lecture on that, trying to what are things that I think work well on slides, what doesn't work well. I don't want to go more into the details here at that point in time. But if you take those simple rules into account that I presented, you should be already do a fairly good job. So we've talked a bit now about maybe what's important in a lecture. We talked a little bit about how you can modify your environment and a little bit about the tools that you can be using. The next thing I want to talk about the structure of a talk, because it's also pretty important on what you can do. So talks have a certain structure. They have a start, they have an end, and typically there's some structure in between that is useful to use in order to convey your message, to make things stick. And in this part, I will actually try to integrate a couple of examples. Examples from my own lectures, examples from Finorob presentation, examples from some speeches, such as Martin Luther King or Annalena Baerbock recently, and try to go through these different speeches that people have given and try to identify elements which really work well or don't work that well. Okay, the first thing is how to start. How should you start your presentation? The important thing is you should start strong with a bold statement, an important question to engage the audience, and never excuse. So when I hear someone saying, sorry, I didn't have time to prepare my slides or my presentation, this is really unacceptable. The only acceptable answer to this is actually stand up and leave the room. Because if someone didn't even took the time to prepare the presentation, to do slides, maybe costing this person 1 hour or 2 hours of their time, and there are 20 people in the audience, now he's wasting 20 times the time that he could invest it in if he would be prepared well. So, I mean, you can't always leave the room. Maybe the person there is very important and you need to be there. But if you have the power, and someone says, I had no time, sorry, I had no time to prepare this presentation, but I'll try to do my very best. Actually, it's a pretty good idea to leave the room. Okay, so assuming we prepare, or you want to prepare, and so what are options for first sentences? What are good starting points if you want to do this? And there are a couple of different ways you can do, and I want to show also a few examples of those possibilities that I've listed here in different examples. So you can start with a question. So for example, I opened the main part of my presentation today with a question because it automatically engages the audience. It's very easy to connect with the audience. The audience has a feeling I'm asking them something, they need to return something to create a connection. That's something which really works well. If you're very experienced, you can actually start with a story. That's something that always feels very uncomfortable for myself, so I rarely do that. But there are people who can do this very well, but start with a small story and then actually guide you to the topic they are talking about. That can be powerful if it kind of feels natural to you. If you give a lot of technical presentation, that's kind of often not the case, but I will also have one example where I will show that this actually worked for me really well. You can start with a very bold statement, a very strong statement claiming something. The only important thing is you need to back that up later on. You can't start with a bold statement and then never come up to that statement. One of the things you can also do is start with a statistic. This is especially if you want to put credibility into your message. If you start with a statistic as a motivation for something, why something is important, people rarely doubt that. This is, for example, something that we have done in the context of the defense of the Finorob proposal. We started basically with the statistics to underline why what we are doing is actually important. You can also start with a challenge or a quiz, which is pretty good if you want to highlight that something is a complex problem. So you challenge the audience taking place in a quiz, and it turns out the audience can't solve the problem. But what you're presenting can solve the problem. That's also very powerful to showcase to non-experts that what you're doing works well. Or you simply say to the audience, what's in there for you? What are you going to learn here? Why does it make sense for you to be here? So these are just different ways how you can start. You can start differently, but these are kind of things which I think work really well for engaging the audience early on, and which works really well as techniques to do. Okay. My start is typically always a why. You can use different things, different elements in here, but the first and most important thing is starting with the why question. Answering the why. Why should I care? And I want to start with an example of the Phenorob rehearsal. So this was kind of once we written the pre-proposal and the full proposal, we were invited by the DFG, being here actually in Bonn in the Kamea Hotel, defending our proposal in front of whatever 16 or 18 reviewers with exactly a certain amount of time and giving a presentation. And I just want to use 1 minute, the first minute that how we started off that presentation, the technical part of that presentation, and basically starting with this slide over here. And what I was basically saying was, we as a society use crops in order to produce food, feed, fiber, and fuel. And crop production is a key element for providing these natural resources to us. There are, however, a lot of challenges that we need to increase the amount of biomass that we need to produce. And if you look into the statistics, taking into account the evolution of the world population and the different needs or different usages that we have, it turns out that the amount of biomass that we need to produce from 2010 to 2050, so within 40 years, is approximately the same amount of biomass that we produced from the beginning of mankind until 2010. And as an additional challenge, we need to do this in a sustainable manner so that the future generations will have the chance to do that as well. And that was basically the opening to the defense of our Phenorob proposal. And it started with kind of a statistics, not really statistics, but a statistically backed up statement, let's say it like this, and saying before why the biomass matters. And then you put yourself into the situation that it's very hard for a reviewer to say what this person said is actually wrong or disbelieving what you're saying. So starting with statistics can be tricky. I don't do it very often, but if you can do this, it can actually be a powerful element. In general, there's one extremely good book by Simon Sinek, which is called Start With Why, which is one of the eye-opening book from my point of view that I have read, which I use for most of my presentation, most of the papers that I write, is the concept that, or it's not even really a big concept, but he has a very clear structure how he starts whatever you're going to present. And he says you should start with why, then come to how, and finally to what. So why is something what you're doing important? How are you actually tackling or trying to solve that what you want to solve? And what are you actually doing? And the problem that a lot of people, especially people with an engineering background, do it the other way around. They know what they are doing, what they did last year, so they will start with what they do or what they did. Then they will tell you how they use this to solve a problem, and later on they tell you why the problem is important. And Simon actually shows that it's the other way around you should present, because it makes it much easier for the audience to grasp. And just to highlight that I'm actually doing this for nearly all my presentation and all my papers, this was the notes that I've written down on a piece of paper actually for this presentation for planning the talk. And I started kind of why, the whys. Most people want to be successful, and success depends on the ability to implant your ideas to other people's heads. I'm actually violating one of my rules that I said before. I'm reading out what's actually written there. But I really wanted to do that because I wanted to show you that I'm actually really writing this down for papers, for example, or also partially for presentations. How I'm actually tackling the problem that I'm tackling is that implanting your ideas in other people's heads require to communicate with them. Right? That's kind of how I want to approach this. And finally, what I'm doing, I'm giving a talk, and great talks are one way to do this, so I'm presenting in this lecture how to give better talks. Because this will lead me to this why. And it's often much better to go from why over how to what than the other way around. And I want to highlight this with a short example from one of my lectures. So assume I'm going to give a lecture on the iterative closest point algorithm. It's one of the lectures that I'm teaching in the summer term. And I want to do a first trial. And I will give 3 different starts for this type of lecture. And then you can decide for yourself which one is better. So I'll start with the first one, which would probably go something like this. Welcome. I'm presenting the Icp algorithm today, which is a technique to align point sets with each other. We are minimizing the square distances and solving an optimization problem using singular value decomposition and the Schwarz inequality, and come up with a closed form solution for that problem. So I basically told you no why, I just told you what I'm going to do in this lecture. Probably fairly boring. By now, probably half of you forgot already what I said, and there's no idea what this is useful for. Okay, let's take a second trial and do it in a different way and see if this is better or not. I'm using roughly the same amount of time. And what I'm now doing, I'm taking the what, how, why direction. So I again start with, welcome everyone. I'm presenting here today my lecture on the iterative closest point algorithm. It's a technique to align two point sets with each other. We are minimizing the squared distances using an optimization problem involving singular value decomposition. This is actually a useful approach because we can align different sensor measurements like laser scans with each other and put them in the same coordinate frame. This allows us to build maps, and maps are super useful for autonomous cars to navigate through the environment or mobile robots to drive around or doing 3D reconstructions of the environment. Okay, so what I've done right now, I started again with the what I'm going to do. I told you how I can use this technique, and then why this result may be relevant for you. What I now can do is I can simply turn that around and not do what, how, why, but do the other way around, why, how, what. And I can start with something like this. Maps are needed for a wide range of applications. Mobile robots need maps to navigate through the environment, autonomous cars as well. Sometimes we want to build 3D reconstructions of the environment. We can build those 3D reconstructions by using different sensor readings, such as laser scans, which generate point clouds, and align them with each other. So we need to put them in the same coordinate frame. And the iterative closest point algorithm, which I'm presenting here today, is one technique to do this. What it basically does, it aligns these point clouds so that we minimize the distance between those points using an optimization problem. And this was the why, how, what approach to the problem. And I hope you've seen that, or at least for me, this why, how, what approach is much more intuitive. I first get an idea that it's something relevant I should listen to. Then I come to the problem and later on what is actually happening. So if you have the choice, I would always go this approach, and this is my golden rule. Start with why is essential. Why, how, what. I use this in every presentation. I use this in every paper since a couple of years, and in every proposal that I'm actually writing. I always use this structure, one after the other. That is how I would recommend to do that, or at least try it. If you think it doesn't work for you, take a different approach. But for me, this works really well. The second part of the structure is this empowerment promise. Something you can do, you don't have to do it. And again, this empowerment promise was promising the audience something that they are able to do after their talk that they are unable to do right now. It keeps people engaged for a fairly long amount of time, especially useful for lectures. So what was the empowerment promise for this talk? I also did one. Especially 2 slides which I was showing, basically saying, if you're an experienced speaker, your presentations will be 2 times better than before. And if you're a beginner, your presentation skills or your presentations are probably 10 times better. You reach 10 times more of the audience, implant their ideas, or keep people engaged, or not make them fall asleep. Often, in technical presentations, we don't do it that explicitly. I try to do this in lectures more explicitly, but sometimes you do it differently. Sometimes you want to do it more subtle. And so this is an example of one of the conference presentations. So this is Igor Boguslavsky giving his 2nd or 3rd conference presentation, ICRA 2016. And he was building a system which allows mobile robots which explore underground environments to return home safely even if everything breaks. So if the mapping system breaks, the robot loses track where it is, he built a system which basically backtracks the platform and gets the platform home. And he started with this. Consider you're a robot, and you're exploring an unknown underground environment, and you want to go home, and the question is, how do you come home? Typically, we navigate back in our map, but what happens if our map is inconsistent, our map is broken? I'm going to provide a way how you can retrieve your robot back without losing it in some hazardous underground environment. And this is also an empowerment promise. Although I'm not promising that you're able to do something, I kind of transferred this empowerment promise to your robot, that you're actually able to retrieve your robot. And this also works really well in presentations, even in technical presentation, that works really nicely. Just try that and keep the audience more engaged. If you say, I never explore a robot in an underground environment, I don't care about this, you don't gain anything from that slide, or not much probably, but you probably wouldn't care anyway. But maybe you do have an idea how that could be useful, and then such a statement is actually really useful. Okay, this was the second part of the structure, which we did. And now question, what is the third part? And now with the third part, you now have the biggest chance from my point of view to ruin your presentation. And the easiest way to ruin your presentation right now is put up this slide. the outline slide. Yes, I'm presenting the motivation of my talk. I give you a formal problem definition, then I'm presenting my approach, later I come to the experiments, talk a little bit about related work, and conclude my talk. And this is basically the information for me to take out my mobile phone and do email or take out my notebook. Because then I don't expect anything interesting to happen in this talk if you start like this. So never, ever use an outline slide. Never. There's no reason to ever use an outline slide. What you want to do is you want to talk about your stuff. For your main thing you want to present, your work, your lecture, your research, the paper that you have written. This is the stuff which is the part number 3 in my notation. Note, however, that sometimes you want to kind of give an overview. You want to guide the audience through something. You can do this. You can introduce parts, saying my talk is structured into 3 different parts, and those parts naturally connect with each other, and you guide the people through those parts. This works. It's kind of a trick to avoid the ugly outline slide and do it in a better way. It also allows you to generate what I call re-entry points. So it can happen, especially in a lecture which goes over 90 minutes, you will lose the audience or part of the audience at some point in time. And if you give the people a chance to re-enter, to get on board again, you have the chance at least that you get them on board again, they maybe lost whatever, a quarter of your presentation, but maybe they can reuse or gain the rest of the presentation. So this is one example from my Photogrammetry 1 lecture where we're talking about how to have a point in the 3D world and map that point through the lens of the camera onto the chip of your camera, so on which pixel it will be in your image. And there are different transformations involved in this. So we are starting with an object over here, and then we have a transformation from the object frame into the camera frame, which happens over here. Then we have a transformation which happens inside the camera, which is actually the central projection, so mapping everything to the small pinhole of your camera onto your image plane. And the image plane is just a virtual image plane. What needs to happen is in order to turn this image plane into pixels, you have a sensor in your camera, and this generates the signal of the pixels. And then as you see, okay, we have 4 blocks over here of 3 key transformations that we're looking into. And I can put up this slide over and over again during my presentation, say, oh, we are currently here, we're talking about this part. Maybe this is super complicated, you get lost. That's okay, now we're in the camera frame, now we do this projection over here. Okay, maybe I can restart now. So giving people the idea where you are and giving them re-entry points is something which is really helpful, especially for lectures, or maybe your PhD defense, especially if your PhD defense consists of multiple parts. So sometimes you have one consistent story through your PhD thesis, but quite often, at least for my lab, for myself, for the people in my lab, often there's different elements in there, different parts which are somehow connected. And you can use this idea or something similar to this really well to connect parts, even say, I only have time to present 2 parts. So I'm presenting this one, I leave this out, I just describe what the output will be, and I present this one. It also works really well. Don't cramp anything into a single presentation. Okay, let's talk about your stuff. Now we have done this, now we want to dive into the details and present what's our stuff, what's our contribution, how should we actually present that? And again, the main motivation is now here to make the information stick with people. So so far we kind of opened the channels to their brain. We told them why, we gave them a promise what we're going to do. We maybe provided a little bit of structure, and now we're going to put this information into the head of the person. So what we want to do is we want to make that information stick. It should enter the brain of the audience and stay there. Right? So it's not just providing information, my starting slide. This information should stick and stay in the head of the audience, and not just for a minute or 2 minutes, hopefully much, much longer, so that afterwards the audience, even whatever, does something. They talk to each other, they share that idea, they derive actions from that, so that there's an additional outcome than just sharing this information. And the question is, how can we make things stick? What are tools that we could use to make information more sticky? And there are different ways how you can do that. One thing is using contrast. And this is something what is done very often in important speeches. You want to generate a contrast between different things. Contrast between what's the state of the world right now and what is the future that I foresee. About what was and what is now. So creating this contrast is one of the style elements to create tension and make things more memorable. So what typically happens in speeches, especially forward-looking speeches, and this is something that Martin Luther King was an expert in, he started with what is and always jumped in what could be. How could a better world look like? Go back to what is, what could be, forth and back, and then state in the end is what could be. It's not always easy to do that, but it's just one element that you can create contrast between what is and what could be, or what was and what is right now, or what is being said and what's the truth, in order to engage the audience into this. And so this is the famous I Have a Dream speech, which she was giving. And this analysis is not done by myself. There is an outstanding book which is called Resonate by Nancy Duarte, who is a speech coach and analyzed a lot of different speeches and also pointed out this idea of what is called a spark line, how you're actually generating this contrast. And so this is basically, there also exists a video on how she presents this. Basically, this is the what is line, and this is what is the what could be line. She's always jumping forth and back. And what she does in her analysis, in order to kind of decompose a speech, what makes a speech engaging, is she wrote down all the sentences on those lines. It's too small to see, it's also just a zoomed in view from the beginning. And then you can label certain things, certain techniques that he used in his speeches. So for example, Martin Luther King used a lot of repetitions. And basically the color codes that you see now are repetitions. So these are always repetitions, the same thing repeated. Here, this thing, same thing repeated. And you can see that most of the repetitions actually happen 3 or 4 times, which is a typical repetition that people do until the stuff reaches the brain of the person and sticks in that brain. So he uses quite a large amount of repetition. And therefore also if you give a lecture and you want to make sure that information sticks with the audience, repeating things, maybe slightly different words, or the same concept with different words, is actually very helpful. Another thing that Martin Luther King did really well was using a lot of visual words, things you can visualize well, to make things stick. Also something you can use in speeches to generate words that are very easy to visualize. It's not always that easy from a technical perspective. If you talk about whatever a new cool state estimation techniques, there are things which are hard to visualize, but maybe you can think about stuff which is more visual, which allows to stick better with the audience. And then if you go on in his speech, we see an interesting part. This is kind of this jumping forth and back all the time. And this is exactly the statements where he says, I have a dream, one day, and goes into the future. And this is the part which happens very often. And most of the people think actually the I have a dream speech, actually this is the beginning, but it's actually not. But this is the most memorable part of that speech, where he says statements like, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a world where they're not judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. So he goes always forth and back, saying, I hope that my children will live in a world, so this is kind of this future, where they are judged not based on the color of their skin, but based on their character. And so he jumps always forth and back into the past and into in the right now and into the future. And these are things which make that very sticky. So actually there's the full video by Nancy Duarte also analyzing other things that he has done, which I really can recommend. Going through it takes a couple of minutes, therefore I didn't include it into this presentation. There are different elements that she used to analyze speeches in this way, which actually make things really visual. And that's a speech which is actually fairly old by now, but the same techniques are still used today. And I brought you a more recent example from Annalena Baerbock giving the speech at the UN on Russia's attack on Ukraine. And I just cut it out, 2 parts of this presentation. And I will play that presentation now. And later we can see what kind of elements she uses. And a lot of things actually similar to what we have seen in Martin Luther King's speech in order to convey a message. And it was actually one of the best speeches from my point of view that she has given.
A baby girl was born in a metro station in Kiev just a few days ago. Her name, I've been told, is Mia. Her family was forced to shelter, just like millions of others across Ukraine. Shelter from bombs and rockets, from tanks and grenades. They live in fear, they live in pain. They are forced to separate from their loved ones because of Russia launching a war of aggression against Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe today's vote is about Mia.
Okay, that was the start of her speech. It's the first minute. Now put down the text, and you can see certain elements that she used in order to make this message as sticky as possible. The first thing what she did, she introduced a person. She could have talked about people in Ukraine in general, but it's much easier to relate actions with a concrete person, making things more concrete. Not necessarily only persons, but persons work really well. You can also, the more concrete you make things, the more stickier they get, and maybe generalize later on. That's also what she does here. She talks about the girl named Mia, which is born, and then relates it to just like other millions of others all across Ukraine. So then generalizing this to others, but first being concrete. Then she uses a lot of words which actually create emotion. Shelter from bombs, fear, pain, forced to separate. And also it creates a story. It introduces a person, a situation, which she then later on picks upon and explains that further. Coming also with a call for action, a vote, because at that day it was about a vote, relating this again to this concrete person. Later on she continues.
Russia's war is one of aggression, and it's based on lies. They were repeated again by Foreign Minister Lavrov at the Human Rights Council today in Geneva. You say you are acting in self-defense, but the whole world watched as you built up your troops over months in the preparation for this attack. You say Russia is to protect Russian speaking from aggressions, but today the whole world is watching as you are bombing the homes of Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Kharkiv. You say Russia is sending peacekeepers, but your tanks are not carrying water. Your tanks are not carrying nutrition for babies. Your tanks are not carrying peace. Your tanks are carrying death and destruction.
Okay, if we again look to the words that she was saying, she was now using this contrast generation that also Martin Luther King was using. Now the contrast is not generated between what is and what could be, but between what's said and what the reality is. And she also uses repetition, always introducing, you say, then what was said, what is claimed to be the truth, and then but, and says what the truth is that we have seen. And she also uses this going forth and back with the repetitions in order to make her point, in order to enforce the statement that what is reported are lies, and what we see is the reality. And creating this tension, this stickiness to later on make her statement about what to do based on this. Coming to the statement that we should stand with Ukraine and support Ukraine in this war from Russia. And again, this was one, from my point of view, of her best speeches that she's ever given, trying to ship this message home, what we should do in here. One of the things that we have seen, especially in the last part, is that emotions work really well in order to create stickiness. So if you generate emotions in people, these are things that people will remember. You may not always like it, you may dislike it, but it's something that you're typically much better to remember if the speeches or the stories are created with emotions. There's also maybe something that you see from TED Talks. So TED is one of those events where typically you have really experienced speakers which give really good presentations. And what you maybe see, I don't know, in 30 or 20% of the presentations which are about different aspects or a lot about also technology-driven, they are motivated with the fact that some person died in the near context of the speaker, and then they relate the activity that they were doing to the death of that person. And this is created to generate a strong emotion. I have the view that this is not always the right way to do this, and I think you don't need to let someone die to get your point across, especially if you talk about some technical development that you are doing. But again, it works really well for remembering things. If you're sitting there in the audience talking about this, say, oh, this seems to be a big stretch, at least compared to what we have seen before. But again, it is something which works and makes things sticky. Also, if you create stories, that works really well. Why is this? So this word story is king because we as humans are trained to listening to stories for thousands of years, or tens of thousands of years. The written word is much, much shorter. So telling stories is something which works really well in remembering things. Stories have been told and given from generation to generation, and this worked well because humans are good in remembering these things. So if you can start your speech with a story, it's something that people are more likely to remember. And there's an example that I want to bring that stories also work in academia. So this is Paul Newman, a colleague from mine, or from us, a roboticist in Oxford, and he's an extremely good presenter, one of the best presenters in robotics that I know. And this was a story. I can't remember where he told it to me. I can't remember the site where we've been in. I don't know which conference it was. I don't even know if it was at a conference, at a bar, or at a conference site, but I still remember that story. And he was doing work on registering radar data. So he has a certain radar on his vehicle, and he wants to make data associations between those radar scans. They're extremely noisy and extremely challenging problem, and they were challenged by this problem for quite a while there. And then he was talking the story how he went to the library looking for stuff and couldn't find anything. And once he went through a book and then finding some approach which claims to solve this problem. And then he reads through this, oh, this looks interesting. And he tells in a really engaging way how he was there at that place reading this book. And then says later on, and then the paper said, oh, this approach works really well. It has one big problem. You can't deploy it in reality because there's too many computational resources. Then he closed the book and said, 1950, yeah, I found the golden nugget. I can for sure solve this today. Because 70 years later, your computers are fast enough to solve those problems. That's how he introduced this story. And it was just a story how he discovered that. But I still remember all those years ago, and by now it has the effect, if someone says, I'm doing registration with radar data, I need to think about him. I need to think, let's see if they cited Paul's work. It was extremely sticky. If you want to dive more into the details why messages are stickier than others, there's also a book I can recommend, which is called Made to Stick. And this looks not into speeches, but into stories in general, and sees which stories are more likely to be retold to other people, and what are elements in there, or what are elements in there that we can use to make things stick better. And it turns out, or they identified 6 different concepts which help you to make messages more sticky. And kind of the initial letters give the word success, so it's even easier to remember. So the first thing is your message should be as simple as possible. Boil it down to its core, to the core idea, and don't present more than the core idea. As soon as your story has unexpected elements in there, surprises where you surprise the audience with something they don't expect, are things which are easier to remember. Other things are being as concrete as possible and maybe later on generalize them. There's also one thing we have seen in the speech of Annalena Baerbock, creating the person, making it very concrete and then generalizing it to other Ukrainians. And so making it first concrete and then generalizing it is much, much better than the other way around. It makes it much easier to remember and also typically easier to understand. And this doesn't only hold for those concepts in speeches, it also holds for books, for example. So when I studied machine learning, doing my PhD studies, 2005, 2006, was reading a book on machine learning, the Alpayadin. And what's great about this book, it first does everything as a 1D example, very concrete, and then repeats the same thing and does it for n-dimensional spaces. So first, very concrete, one-dimensional, you can draw it on a piece of paper. No matrices, nothing, just scalars, just multiplications, everything is easy, very easy to understand. And then he goes to the n-dimensional space where things get more complicated. It's much harder to wrap your head around that. There's also one of those things, first doing it concrete and then generalizing is easier to remember, easier to understand than the other way around. And we as technical people typically do it the other way around. Or in math, we start with this general, theorem of in x being a vector in the n-dimensional space, blah, 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 blah. It's often easier to give first an example of what it means in a very simple setup and then generalize it, or then present the more general concept. The next thing, which is important, is credibility. Is the message credible? Are you a person whom the audience believes that you can actually communicate this? How can we make things that the people trust in what we are saying? And this is something where we actually we can do this quite easily if you present papers. That's why we have an experimental evaluation. We provide experiments for a theory or for an approach and show how well it works and compare to other methods. And this is one way how we emphasize that what we did is correct or is better than what was out there before. And again, then the 2 things I already talked about, emotional and stories are 2 other elements which make things more sticky. So if you have something you want to communicate, you cannot typically add all of this. Your technical presentation will be very weird if you try to integrate all those concepts. But maybe sit down and ask, what's the low-hanging fruit there? What are things that you could elements you can do in order to make your message better. Maybe you start with an unexpected thing, or you start with a story and just ignore the rest. Small things can make the stuff better. Some of the things you may be able to achieve, others not. That's all fine. Pick the things where you can easily make an advancement. I don't want to go into any further details here at that point about your story because it's so much dependent on what you're actually presenting. I just gave you general ideas now for this my story or my stuff part to make things more easy to remember, easier to remember for the audience. Which brings me to my fourth point, and this is something which is very rarely done in technical presentation. This is what I call a call for action or call to action. So you just don't want to only communicate the message to the audience, you also want the audience to do something with it. So what could be a call to action if I'm presenting a paper, a technical paper at a conference? What's the best possible outcome after you presented your talk at a conference? So consider I'm standing here, I'm presenting my paper. What would be the best possible outcome for me if you are the audience?
My work cites your work.
You're citing my work. That's great. That's pretty good. Maybe what needs to happen before someone cites my work?
Pick the method and apply it on your own work.
Download paper.
Download paper, coming close. Yeah, let's say read it. So downloading on its own doesn't help, but reading the paper is the first thing. That means you did a good advertisement in your talk for your paper that people say, oh, that's actually interesting. I'll actually read this paper. And the first step towards applying the methods to a different problem or citing that work. Maybe you also, it leads to the fact that you go out and after having a beer outside, you talk to other colleagues and said, hey, I saw this really cool talk. You really missed something. You should check that out. So they're spreading the word further. Or I'm writing something down and I'm at a conference saying, oh, this is relevant for one of my PhD students. Actually write that down and send them that paper. I'm spreading the word for you. Adding my own credibility to that. They say, oh, that's a good work. Please read that. The probability that one of my PhD students reads it, at least I hope, larger if I say it to them rather than a random person giving at a conference. Or you want to make the person cite your work. What you said before. They say, oh, that's super related to my work. That's maybe not as good as mine, so I can easily cite it. Or I need it as a comparison, as a baseline for my new approach. Or even you want to make them use it. So if you, for example, share code, you provide the software for other people. So you can make that very explicit and ask them, if you have that problem, you can actually try our system. It's free to use. You can just download it. There's an example data. Use it and see how well it works on your data. That would be a good call for action to leading people towards, oh, that software out there, the person claims it's actually pretty good. So maybe I should give it a try and see how well it really works. And once they're using it, they will cite you over and over and over again. So it's cite plus plus, so to say, this effect. Right? So these are examples for call to actions for something where you initially think there's no real call for action when you give a paper presentation. But there is actually a call for doing an action. And then you're basically done. You're coming to the end. So the end is there. Question is, how do you end your presentation? The thing is, you should not just stop. You shouldn't just say, OK, done, close laptop, ready. You need to give the audience the notification that they are actually done. And what is a good last slide, for example, to indicate this? And this depends on the presentation you're actually giving. So let's say you're giving a lecture. Then a good last slide would be a summary of what is the key lesson learned. If the person is sitting in an oral exam, what's the minimum they should know in order to not fail? Or before you send them immediately out of the room. So the key lesson learned is a very good summary for your last slide. It becomes clear, lecture is over now, we're coming to the end, there's a short summary of what I should have learned. It's a very good end. Works well for a lecture, maybe doesn't work that well for something else. Or you are having a paper presentation or your PhD defense. Both things are similar. You want to summarize your key contribution. What was your push with respect to the state of the art? Either for that single work or for the last 5 years you worked on your PhD thesis. Right? So this is the thing you want to end with. This is a slide which will stay there during the discussion and has a chance to be burned into the retina of your reviewers so they remember what your key contributions are. Or maybe you're in a job interview and applying for a faculty position somewhere. What should be on your last slide? And here, I at least have two different options you can take. Some people say, you should actually list your past merits, so your key achievement that you have done in your career. Others say you should actually emphasize what you bring in for the place which hires you. But these days, they reduce all the options that you have down to 2. And maybe you need to make the decision what's more important for you. Do you need to have the feeling you need to stress more on what your past merits are? Or do you need to stress more on what's the benefit that you bring in for the place? Are they looking for something very specific? For example, for a very specific position they need to fill, then it may be better to explain what you bring in, that you exactly fill those holes. If it is a call for a position which is very wide and open, not really well specified, it may be better to go with past merits. It depends a little bit on the situation, what you feel more comfortable with. Or you're giving a presentation in terms of a proposal defense, then I would recommend to end is, what do you want to enable? What is your promise? Is the money that you're asking for well invested? We're asking for 35 million euros for that, but is this well invested money? So you need to explain in the last slide or summarize in the last slide, what is the planned advancement that you are going to provide? This is how I would design my last slides, depending on what kind of presentation I'm giving. If you're doing a dinner speech, that's probably very different. But I stick with here with the key 5 academic presentations. Then, how do you actually end your presentation? What are your last words? A lot of people say, thank you very much for your attention. And this is something we are trained to, and I also use this a lot. The funny thing is, depending on which country you're in, people think, what the heck are you actually thankful for? For not falling asleep? I gave such a shitty presentation and I say thank you for not falling asleep? So it's a tricky question. What also works really well, if you don't want to say thank you very much for your attention, which I naturally do, sometimes I try to avoid this, and then I make the handover to the Q&A session afterwards. Like, I'm done with my presentation. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session which starts right now. I'm happy to answer all the questions which are still open. It makes also clear that the presentation is over, but it's more foresight looking. That's more a personal preference, I would say, and nothing which I can say this is better than the other thing. I have the natural tendency to say thank you, but yeah, you judge for yourself if it's something you like or don't like. We're not there yet. I want to come back to my starting point. We said, how do we avoid that people get bored? So far we talked about structure, so we completed the structure of the talk. How do we start, our stuff, come to the end? We also kind of this going forwards and backs, creating this contrast, also something which avoids boredom. But what are other things that I can do to avoid that the audience gets bored? We said you should present in a passionate way. How do we can present in a passionate way? First thing I said, you should remove all the boring stuff, all the dull stuff. Just try to get rid of it. The other thing which really helps is prepare yourself well and really love the material that you're bringing. So either you have cool props, like Walter Levine, then you can use this, it's fun to do. Or maybe you put a lot of effort into your slides and you really like your slides. So you should love your topic, your slides, and or your props. So for example, when you teach a lecture, there will be always things you don't really like that much. There are a couple of topics you really like, and some of the topics say, yeah, I need to cover that, otherwise the people won't understand the stuff that I'm presenting later, but you're not super excited about it. At least make really good slides, so you're at least looking forward to using your slides or your props to explain the stuff, which makes you presenting in a better way. So make use of rhetorical questions, or even real questions to the audience, and then wait to integrate feedback, especially important in lectures. And typically you have to wait a bit. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. For you, it looks extremely long. When you're standing there in lecture asking questions, oh, why is no one asking a question? You have to wait a little bit. Sometimes it takes a while, but there's also a way to make things less boring. If you're able to have props, blackboard, and slides around, you can do media changes, which also break in the flow and engages other people. Something I can't do really well because I'm mainly using slides, but something you can use if you also use the blackboard, for example. Another question, how many people of you have ever used this key in a presentation? 1. Who knows what this key does if you press this key? 1 for sure. So it turns black. Also, you even have it on the presenter here. You can press the black key here. You can also do, if you prefer white, you can press W and it gets white. What you can do with this, if I do it black, I take away the focus from the screen and reduce the focus on me. So you're looking to me, you're listening to me. If I have a very important point to make, it's a good idea to switch off the slides. So you can use this as a media change if you don't have a media change, but you make a focus reduction on you as a presenter. So what happens if you're still bored? Let's say, whatever. The Phenorob talk I've given 50 times, 60 times, for sure in my whole life. And sometimes it starts to get a bit boring. So what can I do, because I have to give this talk over and over again, to be more interesting? Minimize text on the slides. It's anyway a pretty good idea. Makes it a bit harder to present because you just have not your PowerPoints, which give you always the hint of the bullet point, which tells you what to talk next. But once you're getting bored, see if you can get rid of most of your text and still give a good presentation. You can do a few more presentations without getting bored. What also works well, if you're really keen, is integrate audience feedback on the fly. Asking a question, and try to integrate that into your presentation. So it's very unknown what's going to happen. You need to allocate a little bit of time for that. But this is something you do in order to challenge yourself or improvise on the fly to make things more challenging for yourself. Again, if you feel bored, because if you feel bored, the audience will fall asleep soon. Because if you're bored, there's no way you can entertain the audience. Okay, the next thing is, which is hard to do, and is don't appear weird. It's often easier said than done, but sometimes you have that. You have a person giving a presentation, he says, something is weird, things don't really fit together. What's going on there? If you put yourself into the state where you say, you're very relaxed and comfortable, then this typically doesn't happen. So if you envision you're meeting an old friend you haven't seen for a while, and you talk to this friend, you're typically acting very naturally. And maybe there's something very important you want to tell to him or her. You haven't seen him or her for a long time, and you want to talk to that person. And you have this feeling of, I need to talk to that person. I haven't told you this and this and this. It's an excitement that you're generating from a relaxed situation. Then it doesn't happen. People don't appear weird often. But in presentations, they do. And often this is generated from an inconsistency in their message that they are saying and the body language that they have. If this doesn't fit, people often appear weird. And you can train that in order to avoid that. Not everything, for some people it's very natural, for some people it's harder, but this makes a difference. So there are certain things like walking forward or walking backwards. So when I'm walking backwards from a stage, it appears like I'm escaping from something. So let's say I'm standing here and saying, we presented this really, really cool approach. And by the way, we actually published the code. You can download the code and run it on your own. You will see it works really well. By walking backwards, I'm kind of escaping from that, giving the impression that what I'm saying may not be fully true. So depending how you act or how you use your hands, saying, whatever, this is the approach and the performance gets better and better and better over time. Typically you say better should be like this. So there are a lot of cues where you generate a mismatch between what you say and how you behave, which then makes you appear weird. And this typically happens because you're uncomfortable for some way. There's something you're hiding. And it doesn't happen again if you're in this relaxed situation. And if you have that feeling or that you appear weird, maybe record yourself with your phone and see how you're behaving if the message that you're doing don't fit to your body language. Or things like this. Welcome to this presentation. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm really looking forward to giving this presentation. See, I'm closing up. It's clear that I don't want to give that presentation, and I'm scared or don't want to be here because you're not open. This is also one of those things which generates this. The other thing is, what do you do with your hands? And this, again, is partially a cultural thing. So certain cultures, where you never want to cross the hands behind your back because it's extremely impolite. Something I still naturally do from time to time, but I try to keep my hands open, and when I talk, have the hands visible. You can use this for pointing to something, which I do in the slides. Or you can count on this, whatever. There are 3 important things we want to do. First, we want to implement whatever, something like this. Again, if you say, that's okay. There are 4 different approaches that I'm going to present here. It already starts to be weird, right? So you can actually use those gestures for consistency of emphasizing your messages and not making them weird. Then a few obvious things. Never turn your back to the audience. Always talk in front. Never do something like this and, here, this, and there, this equation. Done, lost. Very quickly. Makes you appear weird. So always try to look to the audience, point here like this. Don't turn around, or if you want to point with your right-hand side, go to the other side of the screen and point over here. Speed of your presentation, something I was extremely bad and I'm still not good at it. I'm speaking too fast, I know this. When I got my PhD head in 2006, the guys who built that head put a small presentation on it with a slides thing rotating with whatever, 2 slides per second, imitating me giving lectures at super high speed because I was talking fast. And I know I'm still talking fast, I need to pace myself down, but often, at least I speak too fast, and you can use speed to emphasize things. But often, it's being more silent and slower that you emphasize things, and not that you talk faster and louder. So being more silent, focusing on something, making a break, drags your attention to me. You can use this. I'm bad at it, but at least if you can do this, something you can exploit. Something I also struggled with was this, and then I give this presentation, especially in my initial lectures that I was giving. In Freiburg, where we started, we were recording the lectures really early on. From 2007 on, we were recording lectures. Luckily, at that time, with some Java recording system without video, unable to be played today. I'm very happy about this. And only later on, went to videos, whatever, in 2012. But I went to the recordings at that time and said, oh, damn, how often do I say, Really, record yourself, try to listen to it. If you don't do it, you're very lucky. Otherwise, really something you need to train or to get rid of that. Last but not least, what I found very weird are bottles. Happens very often in the US. People with plastic bottles, especially with a microphone, standing there like, and then I'm doing this and putting this thing back. I think you should be able to give a presentation without water. And if you really want to do this, here's a glass of water. And I drank once during this lecture. I'm not sure if you realized it, but I did this when I was playing the video of Annalena Baerbock, because then the focus was completely away from me and I could drink. I personally find drinking, especially drinking from bottles, super annoying. Maybe other people have a different view, but I can't. It looks really, really weird to me. Okay, so these are the things which we have done, showing what you can do to avoid to appear weird or what you can do in your presentation. There's something else you need to do before your talk, and this is typically you need to prepare. Nothing comes natural, and giving a talk is something which requires a lot of experience. So you need to train this over and over again. The first presentations I was giving, I whatever, testing them 10 times, 15 times, I can't even recall this. And now, of course, I don't need to do that often because I'm giving a lot of presentations. I was just doing a rough rule of thumb calculation on how many hours already of giving presentations or lectures and end up with something like 1,800 in my whole life, if I count all the lectures, teaching things, whatever, nearly 20 years, not really 20 years, but 18 years now. Every week, you come to a large number of hours if you really count the number of hours. And of course, the more often you do it, the better you get. But you have to train that. And there are a few tricks, and the next trick was the game changer for me in the beginning, because I was giving my talk, and then at some point in time I got lost, and I was completely bad, damn, need to do it again from the beginning, learned it. And then my supervisor, Wolfram Burger, at that time said, yeah, there's one trick you can do. And I want to illustrate this trick. Who knows this sentence? A few people had Latin at school. Gallia est omnis diversa in partes tres. For me, Latin is something I hated. It's 25 years ago, but I still remember the first sentence of De Bello Gallico. Because everyone had to learn it in school. So the trick is learn your first sentence for every slide. Don't learn everything by heart. It comes very unnatural. But learn the first sentence for every slide that you have. The good thing is you always know how to start, and then you're naturally in the flow. And even if something goes really bad and you, damn, I lost track, you just say, doesn't matter, next slide, here I am, back on track. This helped me a lot when I was giving my first scientific presentations in order to do a good job and in order to not fail. And this gave me a lot of confidence in order to present well by learning the first sentence of every slide. Again, If you feel comfortable not doing it, totally fine. But if you feel uncomfortable, it's kind of your backup plan if something goes wrong. It doesn't happen very often, but if it happens, it comes in very handy. It's your own pacifier, so to say. The next thing, videotape yourself. Today, much easier. Just take your mobile phone and videotape yourself giving the presentation. And just look through it. It's super annoying. You see a lot of things you don't like, but it really helps you to improve. So I think when I was doing my first video recordings with the video camera in the lecture hall, 2012 or 2011, something around this time, this really helped me a lot to see, oh man, I really suck at whatever, at that, or this is really bad. And if you go through it, it feels annoying, but this is your way to improve, and it's very objective. It's not the opinion of someone else, it's your own opinion. And for that, videotaping yourself is super helpful. Test talks, also something that we did a lot in the lab. Doesn't happen that much during COVID because there were no real conferences. Gathering in the lab and giving the presentation that you give at a conference as a test talk before, and asking your colleagues to ask all the mean questions. So you know all the mean questions before going to the conference and letting someone else surprise you with a mean question. Also works really well. It's one of those standard tools. If you give your presentation, stay on time. If you have a fixed time slot, stick with this time slot. Typically, if you're a presenter who is not very experienced, you can really time this really well. So see that you cut down your slides until you exactly have the time that you have. Because typically you're anyway 5% faster, but once you're excited, you're at the site, and you finish a little bit earlier. So even if something goes wrong, you still have your 30 seconds extra backup time. This is totally fine. If you're an experienced person, you probably know what you're doing. And sometimes it happens, you integrate audience feedback and you realize everything took longer, and then you said, okay, I know, I'm on that slide. My time slot ends in 4 minutes, but I still know I need 10 minutes more. What I do is I skip stuff. And there's this trick in PowerPoint, probably other presentations of this event, that you can enter a number and press enter and it will jump to the next slide. So towards the end of my presentation, the last 15% or so, I always, in the note field, I have something, time question mark, and then whatever, number, enter. So if I realize I'm running out of time, I know there's a break, I can skip something very easy. Just go there, enter number, enter, no one realizes it, and you have jumped over a couple of slides. Better than, no, I'm too fast. I click, 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 go through your presentation. It always sucks. This is a trick you can do. In the end, you just have to repeat it. Over and over, repeat and practice until you get good. It comes with practice. No one is a good presenter in the first round. Before I'm coming to the end of my presentation, I want to briefly revisit those 5 presentations and explain what I think is important for those 5 presentations, what makes them special, and what you need to look to if you're actually doing this. So for example, what is important for a lecture? What's the purpose of a lecture? Why are you doing it? What's special in here? So the goal is you want to instruct people and give them information. You want to teach them something. And so one of the things you're doing is you're training the next generation of researchers, of students, people which maybe join your lab because they've taken 4 of your lectures. So you want to provide them with information so they're capable of solving something they're unable to solve before. Those lectures are typically very long, 90 minutes, similar to this lecture over here, coming close to 90 minutes. It's a very long block. Avoid boredom at all cost. Generate re-entry points, generate parts, make things exciting. Otherwise, it's really hard for your audience to do this. It requires some practice to do this, but this is something that I would generally recommend. Then you have the problem with slides, which I don't have a good solution for, slides versus a document. A lot of people say, yeah, if I can give a talk like this one over here, I can have very few bullet points on it and very little text. Okay, that works. Need to train it, but it works. But what about the students? I give them material, they need to learn from that material. Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe you want to be a bit more verbose, but then your presentation gets worth. You can generate a second document, whatever, text document, writing down the stuff, but that doesn't really work for me. With whatever, teaching several hours per week, I will not maintain multiple documents because I'm still changing my lectures. I haven't found a really good solution for that. If you have a really good one, I would be happy to hear it. But you want to avoid that your slides turn actually into a document, but on the other side, there should be some material on it so that people can go back to it. Not a good solution yet, but if you just want to optimize the presence of your presentation, reduce text, but you typically want to give people some material to look into. Conference talk. What is important in a conference talk? We said before, most of the people think we want to share the idea, right? But it's not only sharing the idea. You want to generate this action. Read, discuss, cite, use for your paper. Now, how do we do this? If we look to how much time we have in conferences, I just made a small statistic starting when I gave my first presentation. I think it was IROS 2002. We had 17 minutes for the talk plus 3 minutes of questions, every talk. And then this is a rough approximation. It went down, and down. This year, ICRA is 4 minutes, which is ridiculous compared to 20 minutes you had before. So your presentation basically boils down into an advertisement. And again, an advertisement for those actions. You can't explain your whole work within 4 minutes. There's no way you can do this unless you have an extremely trivial idea. But otherwise, just stimulate the audience to read your paper, discuss it, tell them what they can use it for. So they will anyway need to read the paper. No need to go really into technical details on how the stuff is done if you just have such a short amount of time. If you are here in this order, you can go a bit into the details, obviously. But if you're here in this, 5-minute region, that's really hard. What I recommend to explain is, why should I buy it? Ask yourself a question. I would need to pay for that, what you're proposing. Make me willing to give a lot of money to you. So you need to emphasize the value that's in there for me. This works really well. Keep things simple. Again, you can't explain your whole paper. And again, the emotional stuff is really hard to emphasize why your idea is cool. If you're able to do this, it works well. But I'm not sure I do that very well. But credibility is something you can do. Back up your claims. Whatever you claim to do in your paper, back it up by experiments. Something which also holds for every paper. Don't make a claim you can't support. Then we think of a PhD defense. Your goal is to get a degree as a researcher. So you want to get your PhD degree. Here it's important to understand, what does the audience wants to know? What the audience wants to know is this novel research that we have been seeing? Did the person push the state of the art forward? And can the person present, discuss, and defend their work? These are kind of the three things that your committee wants to figure out when you give your presentation. You need to optimize your slides for that. So you can do things like, what is possible now, which was impossible before, which is possible now. So where did you push the state of the art forward that something is possible that you were unable to do before? Which is very related to what are your contributions and something that you have done, not whatever 5 other people around. Use active voice, say I did or we did. Be explicit on what you have done, where you claim your contribution for. Also here, credibility matters. You want to show that the stuff you're presenting is actually correct, so back up your claims, and that's what you have your experiments for. Or your mathematical proof, even better, but often I actually don't have proofs in my presentations, so often we support our claims through experiments. And it's your time to shine. What you also should not forget, what most people forget in a PhD defense, is that at least 50% of your committee is not from your field. They may be the same subject, but they're clearly not from your field. So the problem, what you often do is you lose them too quickly. So you want to explain things for people outside your field. At least they need to understand what the problem is at all. Otherwise, they will complain, and that's never good. And one way how to do this was very nice done by the defense of Olga Wysocka. She was working on place recognition, where you want to recognize based on images taken in the same place, if this was the same place or not, even if the environment has changed. People say, is this a hard problem, yes or no? And what she did, she started with a small quiz, asking the audience, can you determine if it's the same place or not? So even if you have no idea about the techniques behind it, you can understand if this is the same place. And it started with this one. So you have an image taken in summer and an image taken in winter. Is this the same place? And people say, yeah, of course, the same place. You probably see this flag painted there on the building, the structure the same. So yes, this is the same place. Great. Okay, let's go on. Is this the same place, yes or no? Shout.
Yes.
No, it's not. It's the same street, it's in a similar street, in the same neighborhood, but it's not the same place. Okay, again, is this the same place, yes or no? Shout.
No.
Yes, it is the same place. This building was turned down. And this was just a random data set. It was not specifically made for that. We just drove, we had 2 runs, one in summer, one in winter, next to the campus in Freiburg. And then again, is it the same place, yes or no?
Yeah. No.
No, it's not. You can see it here on the windows are completely different. It's even not the same street, same area. So if you start with this, it becomes immediately clear for the audience that it's a challenging problem that you're tackling. At least you say, this sounds completely weird. You failed in solving it. Let's see if your computer can solve it. That's a very good start, which brings in people which are not from your field and showing them that it's maybe not such an easy problem. It's maybe challenging. That works really well, especially for your PhD defense. See if you're able to get the audience on board. They at least understand that the problem that you're tackling is challenging. Next thing is proposal defense. This was a defense for the Excellence University. We were presenting the cluster, Michel, Watt, and myself standing there on the poster. And the question is, what do you want to show? What does the audience want to figure out? It's always the question you should ask first. They are reviewers. They need to evaluate if this is a good or bad proposal. What do they want to figure out? Okay, they want to figure out, is the proposed work that the people are proposing novel and exciting? Right? If it's exciting and novel, that's a very good starting point. What is the expected change? What are you expected to bring in to make the world better, or whatever it is? Is it the right team? Are the people actually competent enough to solve this challenging problem they are proposing? And in the end, is the money worth invested? We need to put in N million euros for that. Is it worth the expected result worth this N million euros? Right? These are questions that you need to answer. So this was a poster presentation, but very much things hold there. So this was our poster, at least the first part of the first poster, 2 posters there. Okay, that was a key question. We could reduce everything to one single key question, what the cluster stands for. You can read it out on your own. I won't read it, otherwise you can't process the language. I'll shut up. And then there are other things. Why is this a challenge? Why is this relevant? How do the people try to solve it? Is this novel? Is this the right team to do that? So you need to be able, you don't need to make it really explicit, but you need to have the individual points in here why this makes sense, why you're the right team, why this is novel, why this is exciting. And this helps you to do a better job. If you want to defend your proposal, I would recommend to do this contrast, what is, what could be. What is the state right now? What could be done if you implemented your approach and 5 years later this thing comes into practice? You can make this change between what is and what could be very well. Well, it's fairly easy, easier than all other presentations. You will need to explain how you plan or will push the state of the art, and you also want to showcase what are your past merits, what have you done so far, and what's your current setup, the work setup. So if people believe you did cool stuff in the past, you're very likely to also do the cool stuff in the future. Okay, and as a last talk, going to the academic job interview. You want to apply to a position. And again, you have to ask yourself, what is it that the audience wants to figure out? And typically, or most of the time, there are just 3 questions that the audience, the reviewers, the committee wants to figure out to decide if they hire you as a professor or not. They first want to evaluate your potential for future outstanding research. Will this person perform great in the future? But that's a very tough question because you don't know what the future will bring. But what you can do is you can make this decision based on their past merits. So what have you achieved in the past? Therefore, it's important to highlight what are your highlights, your key contribution in the past, because this allows a forecast that you have a potential to do something in the future. If you have nothing to show from the past, it's very unlikely that you will just be successful initially and do a really good job on that. So play with that you say you have good past merits and give an outlook what could be in the future. Are you a fit to the institute, to the university, to the faculty, to the surrounding, whatever it is? Do you fit in? Do you fit to the call? It's something you need to emphasize. Sometimes that's very easy, it's very natural, it's exactly the title of the professorship is exactly your PhD thesis, whatever, then it's easy. But most often you need to bend and stretch yourself a little bit. I was a robotics person, I applied for the professorship on photogrammetry here. So I need to explicitly make this point clear why I think I'm a fit to that position. And last but not least, can you educate the next generation of researchers? Therefore, you typically have a test lecture that you need to give. Often you don't need to give it, integrate it into your scientific talk, but you have to give a lecture to showcase this. So my recommendations, and we're coming to an end very soon, is you need to explain in these academic interviews your vision. What is your problem you're tackling or want to tackle, and the approach to this, at least on a high level. So you want to take not the approach of your paper, but put it one step further, the next, 10 papers. What's your research vision that you want to do? You need to show that you already achieved something on that way. 1/3 is done, and I want to do the next 2/3 of it. Which you can use to highlight, I have done already achievements in this direction. So it's credible that you will do the missing 2/3 as well in the next 5 years. So you need to be able to showcase what are your next steps towards this vision, and this vision should ideally align with the interests of the faculty you're applying to, being a fit to the call. What a lot of people recommend is what is called a T-profile talk. So you want to have the talk, a large part of the talk, this is the kind of top bar of the T, being so that everyone can understand it, at least the problem and everything. And then select one point, and they go really, really deep and show that you have technical expertise. And you will lose a couple of people on the way, and then you go back to the top of the T and be easy. And there you make one of those re-entry points I was talking before. So that people who are from the subject say, yes, this person knows what he or she is talking about, but the general audience, which doesn't have this expertise, still gets what you want to do. So they have this balance that some people say, the person's outside my field of view, but I think that was kind of nice, I understood what the person's doing, it fits well. And the other person said, this was exactly my field, the person did an excellent job and tackled this really challenging problem. Then it's a win for you. Once you've done this, you've done your talk, it's often good, especially if you put a lot of efforts into it, to celebrate yourself afterwards. That was Igor Boguslavsky celebrating his ICRA presentation. Was also his birthday, by the way, but had a celebration afterwards after he was very happy with his presentation. So celebrate yourself if you did a good job. That's kind of nice. You reward yourself. Okay, coming to the end now, where can you find other good examples for talks? If you want to look deeper and say, where can I find good talks? What's out there? I find TED Talks most of the time pretty good. There are a variety of subjects, there are even some potentially in a discipline, not that many, some TEDx Talks, which is a subset of these TED Talks. But these are typically people which are good presenters and they're trained specifically for this event to do a good show there. All the talks are, whatever, between 5 and 18 minutes, and they typically do a really good job. Again, you don't need to let a lot of people die. That's my only criticism I have about those talks most of the time. But it's actually, it's quite inspiring to see how you can present. If you want to read a little bit about it, so most of the material that I collected in the two books that I'm using are, the best one is actually this Presentation Zen by Gar Reynolds, which is not only about presentations, but also about slide design. So this is a book I really, really recommend, which is the thing which I like most. There's this Resonate book, if you especially look into speeches and kind of the sparkline stuff and what are elements you can use. Nancy Duarte also does a really good job in here. And then the two things already presented, Start With Why, also for me, a very important book. And this Made to Stick is kind of nice if you want to make your messages a bit more sticky. Then it's at least good to know it, but basically these 6 principles I talked about, there's not necessarily that much more into it, but if you want to dive deeper, have a look. And with this, I'm ending my talk and hope I gave you a bit more instructions to give better talks, make the world a better place. Typically, I never finish a presentation like this, or never did so far, but let's say a more happy place and avoid falling asleep and dying the death by PowerPoint if you have these ugly slides, people not presenting well. So with this, thank you very much for your attention. Not sure this was the right ending, but it's what I'm trained to and what I typically use all the time. I hope you enjoyed it. We can now have questions if you have questions. Otherwise, we can outside have a couple of drinks and chat there in the sun as well. So thank you very much.